Hello and welcome to SilentEcho. There are mysteries that begin with violence, a distress call, a storm, a crash caught by radar, a scream carried over a radio frequency before the line goes dead. Then there are the cases that begin with something stranger, and in some ways much more disturbing. Everything looks calm, the sea is open, the weather is fair, the vessel is still moving, the equipment is still there, the world has not broken in any visible way, and yet the people are gone. In April of 2007, a catamaran named Kaz II was found drifting off the coast of Queensland in Australia. The boat was not wrecked. It was not half submerged. It was not burning. It was not smashed apart by weather or collision. It was simply there, moving across the water without its crew. On board were the ordinary signs of an interrupted voyage. The engine was running. A laptop was on. The radio and navigation equipment still had power. Some reports described a meal partly prepared. Life jackets were still aboard. A sail had been damaged. And the 3 men who had left port on that vessel only days earlier had vanished without a confirmed trace. That is the image people remember. The ghost yacht, the empty catamaran, a vessel that looked at first glance as if the men on board had stepped away for a minute and never returned. It is a case that seemed made for exaggeration. The internet did what it always does with stories like this. It pushed the strangeness outward. It layered the disappearance with drama, implication, and the false confidence of people who were never there. Some told it like a supernatural event. Others tried to turn the boat into a perfect floating tableau, a maritime version of a locked room. There were stories about dinner still set on the table, about a laptop frozen mid-sentence, about a life so abruptly interrupted that it felt less like an accident and more like an erasure. But real cases are almost never improved by embellishment. They become weaker, and the truth about Kaz II does not need embellishment. Because once you slow down and separate what was confirmed from what was repeated, the case becomes even more haunting. Not because it becomes more impossible, because it becomes more human. 3 men set out on what should have been a normal coastal voyage. The boat was later found still capable of movement. Authorities investigated carefully. There was a coroner's inquest, and the most likely explanation that emerged was not paranormal and not cinematic. It was ordinary in the worst possible way. Something small appears to have gone wrong on deck. 1 man may have gone overboard. Another likely entered the water trying to help. The 3rd may have attempted to recover them, or he too may have entered the water in the chaos. In open sea, beside a moving vessel, with no one left aboard in effective control, a moment of trouble can become a fatal disappearance in seconds. That conclusion sounds rational. It is rational. It is also not emotionally satisfying, because it does not answer the deeper question people feel when they look at the photographs of Kaz II after it was found. How does a boat keep going while the people who gave it purpose simply cease to be there? How does a vessel hold onto all the visible signs of order while human life slips cleanly out of the frame? How can 3 adult men disappear from a functioning catamaran in daylight without one body, one witness, or one final clear answer? That is where this story starts. But to understand why it still lingers, you have to resist the easy version. You have to move carefully through what is known. You have to look at the place, the boat, the men, the last normal hours, and the fragile line between routine seamanship and irreversible disaster. Because this case did not become famous only because the yacht was empty. It became famous because the emptiness looked at first too neat. And when emptiness looks neat, people begin inventing meanings the evidence cannot carry. The waters off Queensland are beautiful in the way dangerous places often are. From a distance, the coast can feel forgiving. Blue sky, long light, wide sea lanes. Reefs and islands spread across an expanse of tropical water that tourists associate with sailing holidays, dive trips, and postcard weather. But any serious mariner will tell you that calmness at sea is one of the easiest things to misread. The ocean can look patient, while it is stripping away control one decision at a time. Wind shifts. A line fouls. A sail snaps. One person changes position at the wrong moment. One item goes into the water. One reflex action follows another. And once a boat is moving beside people in the sea, the geometry turns cruel very quickly. This part of the Queensland coast sits inside a world of channels, reefs, current, open stretches, and weather that does not have to be extreme to be dangerous. The distances involved are not always dramatic on a map. That is part of the problem. People imagine maritime disaster as something that happens far beyond the edge of civilization, in a storm so severe that it announces itself as catastrophe. But many fatal incidents happen in ordinary conditions, near well-traveled routes, because ordinary conditions lower guard. A man without a life jacket in open water does not need to be 100 miles from help to be in mortal danger. He only needs to be separated from the people and machinery that can get back to him in time. That is one reason this case has endured. It happened in a zone people imagine as manageable. Not the middle of an ocean crossing. Not a legendary storm belt. Not a hostile polar route. A coastal passage in Australia on a modern vessel with 3 men who were not reckless teenagers improvising a voyage. They were experienced enough to believe the trip was within their abilities. That makes the result feel less like a freak event and more like a terrible demonstration of how little margin sometimes exists between a normal day and a permanent disappearance. The boat itself mattered too. Kaz II was a catamaran, a type of vessel associated in the public mind with stability, comfort, and leisure. Catamarans look composed even when they are under strain. Their wide stance creates an impression of calm. To many people, especially those who do not sail, the idea of 3 men simply vanishing from such a boat feels harder to accept than if the vessel had been a small open fishing craft. The wider the platform and the more modern the equipment, the more unnatural the absence appears. It feels as if there should have been time to do something. To radio. To stop. To recover whoever went over. To leave some conclusive sign. But the sea does not honor the expectations created by appearance. Stable is not the same as safe. Room on deck is not the same as rescue capacity. And modern equipment cannot compensate for the terrifying speed with which a man overboard emergency cannot run the people caught inside it. By the time the public saw photographs of Kaz II under tow, the boat had already become a symbol. The Australian media called it a ghost yacht. International outlets followed. And as with many famous mysteries, the symbolic image quickly began to overshadow the narrower factual one. The emptiness became the story. But emptiness is only the aftermath. To understand the case, you have to rewind to the men who were there before the boat became a photograph. The 3 missing men were Peter Tunstead, his son James Tunstead, and Derek Batten. They were not an arbitrary crew assembled by chance for a charter holiday. They were connected by ordinary bonds of family, trust, and shared purpose. Peter was in his 60s. James was younger and was traveling with his father. Derek Batten was a friend and neighbor. Accounts consistently describe the voyage as part of a longer journey involving the delivery or relocation of the vessel. This matters because it places the trip inside a routine adult world. Responsibility, planning, maritime logistics. It was not a mythic adventure. It was a real voyage undertaken by real men with homes, contacts, and people expecting them at the other end. Cases become stranger when the people inside them are flattened. The father, the son, the friend, the ghost boat crew. Labels are useful, but they do not carry much emotional truth on their own. What matters is that these were men moving through a recognizably ordinary chapter of life. A trip had been planned, equipment had been loaded, routes had been discussed. There were likely expectations about timing, arrival, and contact. Their disappearance was not only a maritime mystery. It was the sudden collapse of a set of assumptions shared by families on land who believed the men would be somewhere specific after some finite number of hours. The sea did not just take 3 men. It broke a normal future in 3 directions at once. We know some things about the departure. Kaz II left Airlie Beach in mid-April 2007. The men intended to head north along the Queensland coast. The exact rhythms of the voyage were mundane enough not to seem important until they became the last known structure around the case. Boats leave. Boats progress. Boats arrive. If communication is not constant, no one panics. That is another element maritime disappearances have in common. Time at sea is elastic. A delay that would be alarming on land may not immediately trigger alarm offshore. That elasticity is practical, right up until it becomes deadly. The world does not know you are in trouble because the world has many ordinary reasons to believe you are simply late. At some point after departure, probably during daylight and under conditions that were navigable enough for the vessel to continue moving, something changed on deck. The exact moment has never been witnessed. There is no surviving radio call that says what happened. There is no onboard camera record filling in the gap. There is only the vessel as it was later found and the chain of physical clues investigators tried to assemble into a plausible sequence. That is where the case moves from maritime life into documentary reconstruction. Kaz II was found on the 18th of April, 2007. It was spotted adrift near the Great Barrier Reef region off the Queensland coast, in waters north of where it had departed. It was not simply dead in the water. One engine was running. The sails were in poor condition, with one reported damaged or badly shredded. A dinghy was towing behind. The table area and cabin gave the impression that the voyage had been interrupted rather than deliberately abandoned. But impressions are dangerous. Impressions create the atmosphere of mystery long before they create understanding. Searchers and investigators entered a boat that seemed to contain the shell of ordinary presence. There was food. There was personal gear. The vessel's radio and GPS equipment offered information about route and drift. The men were absent, but many of the items they would have needed if they had chosen to leave intentionally were still on board. There was no obvious sign of piracy, no major blood evidence, no collision damage that would force immediate evacuation. Life jackets were reportedly still present. The emergency beacon had not been activated. The vessel itself was still broadly capable of movement. That combination of facts is exactly what made the case so ripe for overstatement. Because when the usual reasons to abandon a vessel are not visible, the public mind starts looking for unusual reasons. But unusual is not the same as likely. Before we get into the theories, it is worth dwelling on what a functioning boat actually means in a case like this, because that image of the vessel still moving has done a lot of work in the mythology of Kaz II. To someone who has never spent much time at sea, a boat continuing on course or partly on course without its crew can feel almost supernatural. It looks as if the machine itself has become detached from human logic. But vessels do not stop being dangerous because their operators are gone. In some situations, they become more dangerous. A moving catamaran with a line trailing, a sail damaged, and no one in command is not evidence of impossibility. It is evidence of a crisis that outran human control and left the machinery to carry on without it. That distinction is important, because one of the weakest habits in mystery storytelling is treating the continued operation of equipment as evidence against accident. In reality, it often points the other way. It suggests the emergency did not destroy the vessel itself, it overwhelmed the people first. That is exactly the pattern you would expect in a man overboard chain reaction. One person goes into the water. The boat does not instantly stop. Another person moves to help. The third tries to recover control. A line fouls. The vessel turns badly. Sail damage occurs. Momentum continues. Very quickly, the scene no longer resembles a stable deck with 3 capable men aboard. It resembles a machine slipping out of reach, while human beings are reduced to heads and arms in water that offers almost no second chances. This is where the horror of the case begins to sharpen, not in the emptiness discovered later, but in the likely speed of the fracture. Many enduring disappearances involve a long visible decline. A storm builds. Fuel runs low. Searchers follow a narrowing timeline. Kaz II may have broken in a much shorter and more humiliating way. Not through epic weather or heroic struggle, but through a brief deck emergency in which one correct instinct created a worse situation and then another. The father tries to help the son, the friend tries to help both, or the friend goes over first and the others react, or the sail damage pulls one man out of position and a recovery effort strips the boat of its last margin. Whatever the precise order, the likely explanation is grounded in something deeply human. No one intended to abandon the vessel. They may have abandoned it by refusing to abandon each other. That possibility gives the case its emotional center. Before the world ever heard the term ghost yacht, there was probably an afternoon or morning aboard Kaz II that looked ordinary enough to be forgettable. Men moving through chores, adjusting lines, checking instruments, eating, resting, looking out over water that did not yet appear hostile. That is the part of these stories that matters most and is easiest to lose. The last normal hours, not because they contain hidden signs that fate was approaching. Usually they do not. They matter because once the mystery becomes visible, the normal world collapses behind it. We remember the empty boat. We stop imagining the cups, the voices, the casual comments, the movement around deck, the little physical habits that made the vessel a place inhabited by living people. To make a case real again, you have to restore that world for a moment and let it remain unbroken. A boat underway creates its own small domestic space, even when the voyage is practical rather than leisurely. There are tasks and pauses. Someone watches heading, someone checks a line, someone eats standing up, someone goes below for a minute. Someone notices a problem and says it aloud. Before it becomes a problem, the vessel becomes a moving room with the sea pressed against its edges. On that kind of platform, a crew can feel secure for long stretches because all the components of control are visible and close at hand. That familiarity may be why man overboard incidents are so psychologically violent. They transform a controlled environment into a hopeless one in an instant. 1 second, the person is part of the boat. The next second, the boat is something moving away from the person. This is especially cruel on a sail-assisted vessel or motor sailor because the crew's attention is often distributed. One person can be forward, one aft, one inside. If something happens at exactly the wrong moment, there may be no single pair of eyes holding the whole scene together. Even with 3 people aboard, the geometry can become fragmented. A line movement over here, a shout from there, a shift in helm, a damaged sail, a person in water. Rescue requires coordination. Chaos destroys coordination first. The inquest into the disappearance of the Kaz II crew is one of the reasons this case remains more grounded than many internet retellings suggest. It did not endorse a supernatural gap. It leaned toward accident. The coroner considered the physical condition of the vessel and the most likely sequence of events. The broad conclusion was that one man may have fallen, or been washed, or pulled overboard while dealing with the damaged mainsail or related equipment. Another likely entered the water in an attempt to help. The third then either also went overboard or was unable to stop the vessel and recover the others before they were lost. That explanation is not romantic. It does not give the public the strange force they want. What it gives is something more terrible: plausibility. Plausibility is often more haunting than impossibility, because plausibility means the world can actually do this. It means the case is not memorable because it was magical. It is memorable because a simple mechanical and human emergency appears to have emptied an entire boat. Yet even the most rational explanation leaves emotional problems behind. If one man went overboard, why was there no successful recovery attempt? If 2 were in the water, why did the third not keep the vessel under control? If the engine was running, why did it not remain a usable rescue platform? And if the men were near enough to the boat for any significant time, why was no distress signal sent? Those questions matter, and they deserve honest treatment. But honest treatment also means understanding what open water does to rescue logic. A man overboard situation sounds straightforward in theory because the goal is simple. Turn back, keep visual contact, throw flotation, recover the person. In practice, it is one of the most dangerous emergencies at sea, precisely because simplicity evaporates under stress. The person in water becomes hard to see almost immediately. The boat may still have forward motion, sails or engines may be working against recovery. A trailing dinghy may complicate maneuver. Another crew member may move instinctively rather than strategically. Without practiced coordination and immediate control, the odds collapse frighteningly fast. That is another reason this case resonated with sailors and frightened everyone else. It demonstrated how the ocean punishes interrupted command, not only people overboard, but the break in command itself. If the one person best positioned to recover another becomes compromised, the vessel's ability to save anyone degrades all at once. A boat is not a neutral platform. It is a machine that requires deliberate action to become rescue instead of separation. Imagine the likely first break. One man moves to handle a sail issue or line. A gust or jolt or misstep puts him into the water. Maybe there is no time for a clean, shouted instruction. Maybe there is only surprise and reflex. Another man, bound by the logic of friendship or family, enters after him. At that point, the person still on board is no longer managing a single recovery. He is facing two lives in the water, a moving vessel, and whatever deck problem caused the original emergency. If he throws the helm over too late or too hard, the catamaran keeps its own momentum. If he loses sight of them for a few seconds, the sea starts erasing distance. If he too goes into the water, either by choice or by mishap, the boat becomes what Kaz II was found to be. A functioning vessel with no one left aboard. This is not certain in every detail. It is probable in shape. And that distinction has to remain visible throughout the story. Because cases like Kaz II tempt narrators into false certainty. The empty boat feels like it should reveal a precise story if stared at long enough. But boats are not diaries. They hold traces, not complete testimony. One of the most repeated and least careful elements of the public version of the case involves the condition of the interior when the boat was found. Some reports described food set out or partly eaten. Others emphasized a laptop that was still on. These details became shorthand for interruption. They suggested that whatever happened occurred so suddenly that the men left ordinary actions unfinished. There is probably truth in that general impression. But the more exact and theatrical the detail becomes, the more caution is needed. A boat found after drifting does not preserve time the way a paused film frame does. Objects shift. Appearances mislead. Journalistic compression magnifies the strange. What matters more than whether a specific plate was exactly where later retellings place? It is the larger fact. The men did not appear to have prepared for voluntary abandonment. The vessel looked as though their absence was involuntary and abrupt. That alone is enough to make the case chilling. There is another aspect that adds to the unease. No confirmed body was ever recovered. In disappearances on land, the lack of remains can seem extraordinary. At sea, it is tragic, but not unusual. Water is not a static search field. It is a moving system that scatters evidence and dismantles the assumptions people bring from terrestrial life. A body in open sea can drift, sink, resurface elsewhere, or be altered by marine life and current in ways that make recovery brutally difficult. The absence of remains in the Kaz II case does not argue strongly against accident. If anything, it sits grimly within it. But emotionally, it leaves a vacuum, and vacuums invite stories. Those stories multiplied quickly: pirates, foul play, mutiny, insurance fraud, a deliberate disappearance, the vessel as bait for some larger crime, a freak wave, a rogue encounter. Some retellings even leaned into the eeriest possible interpretation, as if the men had simply been removed from the world while the boat was left behind as an impossible exhibit. That is what happens when a case offers powerful imagery but limited witnesses. The public begins writing endings it can feel. A serious documentary has to do the opposite. It has to feel the pull of those endings, and then step back from them. Let us start with piracy or external foul play. This is one of the easiest theories to imagine, because an empty vessel always seems to imply someone else entered the story. But what supports it here? Very little. There was no clear evidence of ransacking that would suggest robbery. The boat itself was not taken. Valuable equipment remained. The disappearance pattern does not naturally fit an external seizure in which perpetrators somehow remove 3 men without leaving stronger forensic signs and then abandon the catamaran to drift with engines still running. Could another vessel have encountered them? Of course, the sea is not closed, but possibility is not evidence, and in this case, the evidence did not push investigators toward piracy as the leading explanation. What about deliberate disappearance? This, too, is a common refuge in unresolved cases. If bodies are not found, maybe the men chose to vanish. Maybe they transferred to another vessel. Maybe the empty boat was staged. But this theory is weak for the same reason many staged disappearance theories are weak. It asks for elaborate hidden planning, where the physical evidence already supports a simpler accidental chain. It also asks us to ignore the condition of the vessel and the practical difficulty of orchestrating such a vanishing at sea without leaving a better trail toward motive, contact, or later life. Ordinary people do not erase themselves with nautical theater for no reason, and no persuasive reason ever emerged here. Another theory centers on weather. Perhaps a sudden squall or rogue sea condition threw all 3 overboard. This sounds less sensational than piracy, and therefore more plausible at first glance. But again, the details matter. There was no evidence of catastrophic damage consistent with a major weather event, overwhelming the vessel itself. The boat survived well enough to continue moving. That points not toward an all-at-once environmental catastrophe, but toward a more local deck emergency in manageable broader conditions. In other words, the sea did not need to become apocalyptic. It only needed to create the wrong moment for human balance and decision-making. This distinction between dramatic conditions and fatal conditions is one of the most useful lessons in the whole case. Catastrophe is often imagined as scale, huge waves, black sky, crashing rigging, but many maritime deaths happen in conditions that look survivable from a distance. The fatal factor is not always the size of the environment. It is how completely it punishes loss of contact between person and vessel. Once you are in the water and the boat is no longer under command, even moderate conditions can become final very quickly. That is why the father-son element in Kaz II matters emotionally. It deepens the likely logic of reaction. If James went over, could Peter have stayed on deck and managed a purely procedural recovery? Maybe in theory, but in life, people are not theory. A father seeing his son in the water does not necessarily become calmer because seamanship manuals would prefer it. He may move to help first and plan second. A friend seeing both father and son overboard may do the same. This is not irrational in the moral sense. It is human loyalty colliding with a medium that rewards detachment and punishes instinct. One of the bleakest possibilities in the case is that what erased the crew was not panic alone. It was care. The geography of the search also matters. Once Kaz II was found, authorities conducted search operations over sea and air, but the search field for 3 men already separated from a moving vessel is vast. Even before drift complicates everything further. The time between the men entering the water and the empty boat being discovered could already have put recovery beyond realistic range. And because there was no confirmed distress call or exact timestamp for the emergency, the search was never a matter of retracing a single moment. It was a matter of trying to project where people with no boat and possibly no flotation would have ended up in a system of moving water over a span of uncertain hours. This is where maritime search and rescue becomes especially cruel for families. On land, the public often imagines that a search works outward from the last known point, and if the effort is large enough, it should eventually touch the missing. At sea, the last known point is often more like a fading hypothesis. The water keeps revising it. By the time the empty vessel is found, the sea has already had its lead. For the families of Peter Tunstead, James Tunstead, and Derek Batten, the emotional violence of the case must have arrived in layers. First, the shock that the boat was found without them. Then the period of official search and the hope that perhaps they had been picked up or were somehow still alive. Then the growing understanding that the likeliest explanation was not survival but a brief deck emergency with no witness left to tell the final sequence. There is a particular kind of pain in maritime cases where the machine returns. But the people do not. The boat becomes a physical accusation. It says something happened here. It cannot say what. And because the boat remained so central, every small onboard detail became charged with interpretive power. The dinghy towing behind meant one thing to some observers and something else to others. The condition of the sail suggested damage, but damage caused by what sequence of actions? The running engine implied interrupted operation, but interrupted by what exact decision? The presence of safety gear on board suggested the men had not voluntarily left prepared, but did it also mean they were caught too fast to grab it? Each clue was narrow. Together they pointed in the same general direction, yet none could transform probability into certainty. This is the space in which unresolved cases do their deepest work on the imagination, not when there is no explanation, but when the explanation is broad enough to make sense and narrow enough to leave the final moments unwitnessed. To understand why this particular case became so public, it helps to think about another pattern. People are especially disturbed by disappearances that seem to violate the logic of enclosed or bounded space. A locked room with no intruder, a plane with no wreckage, a boat with no crew. We are trained by ordinary experience to believe that objects and people remain associated. A car contains its driver. A house contains its residents. A boat contains its crew. When that association breaks, the mind does not merely ask what happened. It asks whether something more fundamental has failed. Kaz II is powerful because it presents one of the cleanest maritime versions of that break. Here is the vessel. Here are the traces of occupancy. The occupants are gone. But sea logic is not room logic. The ocean makes absence look cleaner than the actual event was. 3 men do not simply disappear from a boat. They disappear through a chain of speed, distance, motion, visibility, and failed recovery. The water edits the event. It removes the scramble, the shouting, the desperate calculations, and leaves the public with an image of stillness. That stillness is deceptive. It is aftermath pretending to be mystery. The timing of the last normal contacts and sightings carries its own unease. The men had left within a routine travel framework. There was no famous final message, no ominous call saying something was wrong. The case therefore lacks the dramatic punctuation many disappearances have. This absence of punctuation makes it more haunting in a quieter way. The normal world did not receive a warning. It received a result. The next thing anyone knew for sure was that Kaz II was being seen without them. There are cases where the last hours are thick with clues because the missing were already in distress. Kaz II was different. The likeliest emergency seems to have erupted after the period in which anyone on land still had reason to listen closely. That means the crucial human transition in the story probably took place in privacy. Not emotional privacy, but spatial privacy. No witness, no camera, no surviving narrator, just the boat, the sea, and 3 men making increasingly consequential choices inside an emergency that offered almost no margin for error. This is why the case feels cinematic without needing to be dramatized. Its power comes from contrast. The vessel remains. The men do not. The likely explanation is rational. The result still feels surreal. The sea around Queensland can look bright and inviting. The event it may have hosted was swift and merciless. There is no need to force the story into more exotic territory. The truth already contains the essential horror. A modern catamaran can keep moving after it has lost every human being meant to stand on it. If you stay with that idea long enough, the case begins to change shape emotionally. At first, it looks like a mystery of disappearance. Later, it begins to feel like a story about sequence. Which man went over first? What did the others do in response? At what exact point did recovery stop being possible? Did one man remain on board longer than investigators believed? Did he see the others drifting away? Did he manage a turn and lose them? Did he choose to enter the water because staying aboard felt like abandoning them? These questions can never be answered with confidence. Yet the emotional force of Kaz II lies partly in how powerfully it raises them. A good documentary has to acknowledge another uncomfortable fact here. The leading theory may be correct and still leave one of the case's strongest public images slightly overstated. The boat was not a supernatural tableau frozen in impossible calm. It was a vessel under conditions of interrupted control. Reports of food on the table and a laptop on become eerie because they humanize the interruption, but they also risk making the disappearance seem more polished than it was. Real emergencies are messy. A rope under tension, a sail slamming, someone slipping or shouting, a person in water swallowing panic and spray, another trying to pivot the boat. The public image of Kaz II is eerie because the mess is gone by the time the boat is found. The sea and time have already taken it. That matters because it returns us to the men themselves. Peter, James, and Derek were not characters arranged for effect. They were the missing center of that erased mess. If the inquest's likely sequence is broadly right, then their final minutes were not mystical. They were physical, immediate, and probably shaped by care for one another. The father-son bond invites one kind of rescue reflex. Friendship invites another. In that sense, the case may be less about vanishing than about the terrible cost of refusing to leave another person in the water. Yet even that phrasing has to be held carefully. We do not know whether one of them consciously chose to enter the sea or was himself pulled by unstable footing, damaged sail gear, or the movement of the boat during a recovery attempt. The exact mechanism remains blurred. What remains clear is that no theory has explained the totality of the known evidence better than accident cascading through human response. This is where the story reaches one of its most useful and most painful insights. In many haunting disappearances, the central mystery is not where the missing went. It is how small the initial failure may have been. Kaz II does not appear to require mutiny, crime, supernatural force, or bizarre conspiracy. It appears to require a moment. One problem on deck, one person overboard, a rescue attempt, a vessel not neutralized in time. Everything after that is the ocean enlarging a moment until it becomes a permanent absence. That kind of mechanism is terrifying because it removes the comfort of exceptionalism. If a case requires monsters or elaborate plots, most viewers can place it at a distance. If a case requires only routine coastal sailing and a brief emergency, the world feels thinner. Safer places become less safe. Normal days become less guaranteed. The distance between ordinary life and irreversible disappearance narrows. There is another reason the case refuses to settle. No one survived to provide even a partial narrative. In many accidents, one person lives long enough to tell investigators what the others were doing, where the equipment failed, how the weather shifted, or what choice became fatal. Kaz II denied that closure completely. The sea kept all three voices. And when three voices vanish at once, the public often interprets silence as mystery rather than what it may really be. A successful accident with no witness. That phrase sounds harsh, but it captures something important. We often reserve the word successful for human goals. In the ocean, an accident is successful when it wipes out the people who could have resisted it and leaves no full witness behind. Kaz II may be one of the clearest examples of that kind of event. The boat did not sink. The machinery did not fail outright. The emergency succeeded by isolating the people from the platform and then letting the platform continue without them. Some of the most haunting maritime cases contain one object that becomes a symbol of interrupted life: a mug, a pair of boots, a radio left on. In Kaz II, the symbol is arguably the whole boat. The catamaran itself becomes an object left behind by the living. It is a far more powerful image than any single abandoned item, because it is both shelter and evidence. It is a complete system that should have guaranteed some degree of continuity, and instead became the stage for absolute discontinuity. One of the dangers in telling a story like this is allowing atmosphere to outrun proportion. The vessel's emptiness is cinematic. The ghost yacht label is sticky. It is tempting to lean into the eerie and keep the explanation as suspended as possible because suspense retains attention. But your audience deserves something better than manipulated uncertainty. The case is strongest when its rational center is allowed to stand. Not because that destroys the mystery, because it redirects the mystery toward what actually matters. Not what supernatural force emptied the boat, but how three men could vanish from a working vessel so quickly that no one was left to save the others, or even mark the moment with a call for help. To answer that, you have to think about man overboard emergencies not as tidy drills, but as crises of shrinking options. The person in the water is harder to see than people imagine. The boat is harder to position precisely than people imagine. Human instinct is harder to subordinate to procedure than people imagine. Even trained crews can lose the person in seconds. With only 3 men aboard, every body matters. Lose 1 and 2 remain. Lose the second and the boat is operating without the redundancy needed for clean recovery. Lose command for another few moments, and the vessel itself becomes an adversary. Not malicious, simply moving. This is one of the bleakest truths the Kaz II. A boat can become the thing you cannot catch. The platform built to keep you above the sea can become, once command fails, the mechanism by which the sea separates you from every remaining chance. By now, the broad sequence may feel emotionally familiar. Calm, beginning. Small break. Expanding loss, empty boat. But a long-form documentary should not move past the search phase too quickly, because the first official response tells you what the world believed was still possible. When Kaz II was found, authorities did not treat the situation as instantly closed. Search operations were launched. That matters because search is institutional hope. Search says the world has not yet accepted that its missing have already crossed beyond recovery. Aircraft look, vessels look. Distances are calculated. Possibilities are projected. The public sometimes sees the search only as procedure. For families, it is the last structured expression of belief. At sea, though, the optimism embedded in a search can be brutally thin. Searchers know what the public often does not. A few hours matter. Visibility matters. Water temperature matters. Flotation matters. The precise time of entry matters. Whether the missing are together matters. Whether they were wearing life jackets matters. In the case of Kaz II, too much of that crucial information was unknowable. The crew could have entered the water long before the vessel was sighted. They may have had little or no flotation. They may have been separated. The window for rescue may already have closed long before the first search plan was drawn. That does not make the search pointless. It makes it tragic in a more exact way. The authorities were searching not just the sea, but the uncertainty created by missing time. When time is missing, water becomes enormous. And then comes the period after search, the period every unresolved disappearance enters sooner or later. Administrative closure without emotional closure. Files inquest. Statements. Speculation. The lives of the missing stop moving in public except through questions. Families live with asymmetry. The state can decide what is most likely. It cannot return the body that would allow mourning to take a different shape. That asymmetry matters because the public often mistakes an inquest conclusion for emotional completion. It is not. A coroner can say accident is most likely. A family still lies awake inside the details that remain unwitnessed. That is perhaps the deepest unresolved element in Kaz II. Not what happened in a broad sense. What it felt like in the final minutes to the men involved. Which one saw what? Which one still believed recovery was possible? Which one entered the water out of deliberate loyalty, and which one was taken by circumstance? Those are questions the case can never answer, and they are precisely the questions that give it staying power. For a channel like SilentEcho, that is where the case becomes powerful. Not as a sensational ghost story, but as a study in how emptiness can be created by speed, care, and the ocean's refusal to preserve the human sequence that produced it. It is also worth addressing one more subtle weak spot in the case. Because the popular image became so strong, later retellings often merged confirmed facts with dramatic filler. The danger here is not only factual sloppiness, it is tonal distortion. If you treat every onboard detail as sacred mystery evidence, the story becomes less adult. The stronger approach is to acknowledge the eeriness while refusing to be ruled by it. The laptop being on matters only in that it reinforces interruption. The reported meal or table setting matters only in that it suggests no deliberate orderly abandonment. The damaged sail matters far more because it points toward mechanism. The running engine matters because it shows the boat remained capable of separating itself from the men even after the emergency began. In other words, some details are atmospheric. Others are explanatory. A disciplined script knows the difference. Once you distinguish those, the case sharpens. The strongest physical line in the evidence is not interior eeriness. It is deck instability and loss of command. That is where the inquest placed weight, and for good reason. Because in maritime cases, the line or sail or procedural problem on deck is often more revealing than the untouched mug below. Real danger tends to enter through work, not through symbols. There is another quiet cruelty here. Had even one man remained aboard long enough to establish control, there might have been a chance. Had the engine been neutralized immediately, or the turn begun under good visual contact, or flotation deployed at once, or the emergency occurred under slightly different geometry, the story might never have reached the world. It might have become an anecdote about a frightening near miss. Instead, the sequence crossed some invisible threshold where the crew stopped being a crew and became three separate, vulnerable bodies in water beside a boat no longer truly theirs. That threshold is the real mystery line in Kaz II. Not because we cannot imagine what happened after it, because we cannot know exactly when it was crossed. As the years passed, the case settled into public memory, less as an active unsolved investigation than as a haunting example of maritime disappearance. That shift is important. The inquest did not produce a glamorous answer. It produced a sober one. Yet the glamour of the ghost yacht remained because the image is stronger than the paperwork. This happens often. Institutions arrive at probability. Culture preserves atmosphere. The documentary challenge is to let both exist while keeping them in the right order. Atmosphere first for entry. Probability first for understanding. What does the strongest rational theory explain well? It explains why the vessel was found functioning but empty. It explains the damaged sail. It explains the lack of distress transmission if events escalated too quickly and the last person aboard was fully occupied or soon overboard himself. It explains why life jackets and other gear remained on the boat. It explains why no sign of organized departure was present. It explains why no later evidence of deliberate disappearance emerged, and it fits the coroner's own conclusion. That is a lot of explanatory power. What does it fail to explain fully? It does not identify who went over first. It does not determine whether the second man entered the water intentionally or accidentally. It does not tell us whether the third man lost control of the vessel while trying to recover them, or whether he too was taken by the same deck problem. It does not locate the bodies. It does not give families a final spoken account. But those are not failures of the theory itself, so much as the natural limits of unwitnessed events at sea. Now compare that to the more sensational alternatives. Piracy or violent external foul play explains very little of the onboard condition and requires additional unseen actors without physical evidence strong enough to support them. Supernatural or impossible removal explains nothing at all beyond the emotional reaction people have to the image of an empty vessel. Voluntary disappearance asks us to believe the men chose to vanish while leaving behind an evidentiary scene that overwhelmingly resembles interrupted control rather than staged escape. A sudden singular environmental event that swept all three overboard at once sounds plausible only until you consider the condition of the boat and the absence of evidence for a broader catastrophe affecting the vessel itself. In every case, the alternative theories are weaker, not because they are unimaginable, but because they are unnecessary. The leading accidental sequence already explains the facts with fewer assumptions. And yet, even once you accept that, the case does not lose its hold. It changes from impossible to unbearable. That may be the deepest category of mystery documentaries. Not the cases where nothing makes sense, but the cases where too much makes sense, and the result still feels unreal. Try to imagine the moment after the second man enters the water. The third is alone on deck. Ahead of him not an abstract emergency, but people he knows. If one of them is his son, the emotional field is even narrower. Every second becomes a fight between seamanship and urgency. He has to keep them in sight. He has to position the vessel. He has to avoid making the boat itself a weapon. He has to manage propulsion, lines, and maybe damaged sail. He has to think while panic is trying to become motion. And if he fails, the failure is not private. It becomes a drifting vessel that the whole world will later look at and ask how three men could vanish from it. This is why the case feels so intimate despite occurring at sea. Its true setting is not the broad ocean. Its true setting is the shrinking human circle around a crisis. The father, the son, the friend, the boat, the water. After that, nothing else matters. Not the coast, not the headlines, not the later labeled ghost yacht, just a crisis inside a few yards of sea and fiberglass that becomes permanent because there are no spare people left to contain it. There is also a harsh lesson here about crew size. 3 people can feel sufficient for a coastal passage. In many conditions it is sufficient. But in an emergency, it creates terrible fragility. 1 overboard leaves 2. 1 more compromised leaves a single point of control. At that point, the vessel's rescue capacity and command capacity begin collapsing together. That does not make the voyage irresponsible on its face. It does explain why a manageable boat can still become a fatal trap when the emergency targets people instead of hardware. If there is one phrase that captures the emotional logic of Kaz II, it may be this: the boat survived the emergency. The men did not. That imbalance is the source of the haunting. We are used to thinking of vessels as more vulnerable than people. In shipwreck stories, the boat goes first. Here the opposite appears true. The catamaran endured long enough to testify to absence. The human beings were the fragile part. That reversal is part of why the case still echoes. It does not confirm our most familiar disaster narrative. It subverts it. There was no spectacular wreck to explain everything away. There was only an intact enough vessel that turned the disappearance into an argument between appearance and likely reality. For viewers who come to cases like this looking for the inexplicable, that can be disappointing. But for anyone who values real investigation, it is the point. The world does not need to become supernatural to be terrifying. Open water beside a moving boat is enough. Care turning into fatal reaction is enough. A damaged sail and interrupted command are enough. The sea does not need to keep a ghost story alive. It only needs to leave behind a machine and take the witnesses. By the end of the inquest, the state had done what it could. It named the most likely pattern. and acknowledged that certainty was gone with the men themselves. That is often the most honest ending real cases can offer, not revelation. Limits, and limits matter. They stop us from lying. They stop us from converting emotional force into invented detail. They also return dignity to the missing by refusing to use them as props for a better story. Peter Tunstead, James Tunstead, and Derek Batten do not need a paranormal ending to be memorable. They are memorable because something as simple as one person entering the water may have pulled an entire boat empty. That is where the enduring question remains. Not whether Kaz II was haunted, not whether some dark hidden actor stepped aboard, but whether the final moments were shaped by one man's accident or by another man's refusal to leave him behind, whether the engine's continuing sound meant lost opportunity measured in seconds, whether the third man saw a recoverable situation become impossible in real time, and whether the emptiness that later looked eerie was, in the moment it was made, full of noise, movement, and desperate loyalty. The sea will not answer that. It almost never does. What it leaves instead are objects and probabilities. A catamaran under tow. A damaged sail. Reports of ordinary things left in ordinary places, an inquest record, and the still unresolved emotional shape of 3 missing men whose last minutes almost certainly unfolded within sight of the one thing that could have saved them. That may be what makes Kaz II such a perfect SilentEcho case. It contains no confirmed final message, no found body, no dramatic confession, no supernatural proof. Just a vessel that should not have been empty, and a sequence that was probably simple enough to happen and terrible enough to be remembered forever. Because the hardest cases are not always the ones that defy reason. Sometimes they are the ones reason can almost explain. And in some ways, almost is worse. Almost means you can stand at the edge of the answer and still never cross it. Almost means the shape is visible, but the human voices inside it are gone. Almost means investigators can say what probably happened while families still lie awake asking who reached for whom first. Almost means the public gets a ghost yacht, and the people who love the missing get no last certainty at all. If you strip away every label and every later retelling, that is what remains. 3 men left on a routine voyage, a boat found alive without them, a likely accident expanded by open water into permanent absence, and a silence that was not empty at all, but built out of the final unwitnessed seconds in which ordinary loyalty may have become fatal. Whatever happened on Kaz II did not need to be impossible to become unforgettable. It only needed one wrong moment, and no one left aboard to tell it. What do you think happened on that catamaran in those final minutes? Did one man go over first, and the others follow to save him? Did the damaged sail create the first break? Or is there some part of the sequence the official explanation still cannot fully reach? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more real disappearances, wilderness mysteries, maritime vanishings, and dark documentary investigations, told with atmosphere, restraint, and evidence first, subscribe to SilentEcho and like this video. I will see you in the next investigation. There is value in going back even further, before the boat was found and before the public had a mystery to stare at, to the simple decision to undertake the voyage at all. Because whenever a disappearance becomes famous, people begin rewriting the beginning as if danger had been obvious from the start. They ask why the men were there. Why this boat? Why this route? Why not wait for different conditions? Why not crew the vessel with more people? It is the language of hindsight trying to protect itself. If the victims made some glaringly foolish choice, then the viewer can feel safer. The world becomes moral again. That temptation should be resisted. Nothing in the broad outline of the trip makes it sound like a mythic gamble. Coastal deliveries and repositioning voyages happen all the time. Adult men familiar enough with boats to undertake one do not experience themselves as characters walking into legend. They experience themselves as people doing something practical, maybe enjoyable, maybe tiring, maybe routine. One reason disappearances unsettle us so deeply is that they expose how rarely catastrophe introduces itself honestly at the beginning. Most final journeys do not feel final. They feel scheduled. The same is true of boats. After an empty vessel becomes famous, the public starts reading symbolic meaning into every feature. But before the event, a boat is mostly work. It is maintenance, navigation, cleaning, checking small judgments, and the accumulation of ordinary trust. Trust in equipment, trust in weather, trust in skill, trust in one another. All maritime travel depends on that trust, because no one can hold every possible failure in active awareness at once. If they did, no vessel would ever leave harbor. Safety at sea is not constant fear. It is disciplined confidence. Cases like Kaz II are disturbing because they show what happens when disciplined confidence meets the one event it cannot survive. Even the term ghost yacht distorts this in subtle ways. It turns the vessel into an object of folklore instead of what it really was, a functioning craft that outlived its crew. Words matter. Ghost yacht suggests something expressive, as if the boat itself were speaking or haunting. In truth, the emptiness of Kaz II spoke only because the men who could have explained it were gone. The catamaran was not eerie in intention. It was eerie because human context had been violently removed from a still recognizable scene. There is an old maritime truth that the sea is most frightening, not when it appears alien, but when it remains completely itself while human plans fail inside it. Kaz II fits that truth almost perfectly. There was no need for the ocean to transform. No towering spectacle was required. The water only had to do what water always does when bodies enter it without control, and the vessel that should recover them keeps moving. It widened. It concealed. It took distance and turned it into finality. One question that often receives too little attention in retellings is the role of the dinghy. Reports noted that a tender or dinghy was trailing behind Kaz II when it was found. To some people, that detail sounds ominous in a cinematic way, another small object left in motion after the men vanished. But practically it may matter, because any towed object can complicate maneuvering during an emergency. A trailing dinghy is not automatically dangerous in normal operation. In a man-overboard event, though, normal operation ends. Anything behind the vessel becomes another variable, another line, another source of drag, another visual distraction, another way for the geometry of recovery to become more difficult. This does not mean the dinghy caused the disappearance. It means the boat was not a clean platform in some abstract sense. It was a real working vessel with real details that could help turn a solvable problem into an unsolvable one. That is another thing sensational versions of the case tend to flatten. They treat the catamaran as a static stage. It was not static. It was a moving set of forces: engine thrust, wind, damaged sail pressure, tow, current, crew movement. Every one of those forces could have mattered in the crucial minute, and it may have been only a minute. That is the part most people underestimate. They imagine that 3 adults on a boat would have had many chances to correct the problem. Time enough to call out. Time enough to throw flotation. Time enough to turn. Time enough to radio. Sometimes that is true. But once the emergency is the loss of one person from the boat, the available time contracts brutally. You have to recognize the event instantly. You have to keep visual contact. You have to choose between direct rescue and preserving command. You have to know who is doing what. You have to avoid creating a second casualty. If the first seconds are confused, the emergency stops being one problem and becomes several. This is why crew training matters so much, and also why training alone cannot erase the emotional violence of certain emergencies. A man-overboard drill is one thing in calm instruction. A father seeing his son in the water is another. A friend seeing both disappear astern is another still. Real life does not separate competence from attachment. It entangles them. The very love or loyalty that makes someone a good companion can make him a vulnerable rescuer when speed and detachment are required. The coronial findings reflected that practical understanding. The official process did not need to accuse the men of recklessness to explain their deaths, nor did it need to posit some hidden malicious force. It acknowledged a most likely sequence consistent with the boat's condition and with known maritime hazards. That is a deeply important point because it separates the case from the mythology that grew around it. The state looked at Kaz II and saw not an impossible tableau, but an accident field. Public culture looked at the same boat and saw a ghost story. Both responses arose from the same image. Only one was disciplined by evidence. There is another quiet fact that pushes against the wilder theories. No reliable sign ever emerged that the men had survived long after the emergency or reached land. No credible financial trail, no proven contact, no recovery that suggested a later violent crime after departure. The case's power comes not from conflicting strong explanations, but from one strong explanation and several emotionally attractive weak ones. That matters because a responsible documentary should not create suspense by pretending the weak ones are stronger than they are. At the same time, restraint should not drain the story of feeling. The likely accidental explanation is not dry. It is devastating. Imagine the third man alone on deck after the others are already in the sea. If he was Peter, then his son is out there. If he was James, then his father is out there. If it was Derek, then two people he knows are suddenly lives in the water, rather than companions on a voyage. In that instant, the boat becomes a test of impossible priorities. Protect the vessel or close distance. Keep command or get closer. Throw something or turn harder. Call on the radio or never take eyes off the men. Every option is right for 1 second and wrong for the next. Maritime emergencies are often described in technical language because the sea punishes sentimentality, maintain visual contact, reduce speed, execute recovery, but technical language hides the human cost of decision. The Kaz II disappearance forces you to picture what procedure feels like when the people in danger are not abstractions. They are people whose voices you know. This is part of why the case continues to haunt. Not only the absence, the likely emotional content of the emergency before the absence became visible. The father-son element creates another layer too. Public imagination tends to freeze Peter and James in a symbolic relationship, the father and the son. But every family relationship is lived through ordinary specifics. Shared speech, habits, levels of confidence, ways of handling stress. We do not know whether Peter was the more experienced sailor or whether James was equally comfortable on deck. We do not know how they divided tasks or what their usual dynamic was under pressure. What we do know is that emergency at sea strips people down to relationship as much as to skill. A father may act like a father before he acts like a mariner. A son may do the same in reverse. Those choices are not irrational in a human sense. They are simply dangerous in an environment where survival sometimes depends on resisting the first moral instinct. This is one reason the likely accident theory, though rational, never feels emotionally complete. It can tell us what probably happened to the bodies. It cannot tell us what happened inside the bond between the missing in the last seconds, before recovery became impossible. And that missing emotional sequence is exactly where haunting lives. If you compare Kaz II to other maritime disappearance cases, another pattern emerges. Many famous empty vessel cases involve assumptions made on land by people viewing photographs after the fact. They see a chair, a chart, an open hatch, a meal. They imagine an abrupt theatrical interruption because objects are static and legible in photographs. But objects do not preserve time cleanly. They preserve aftermath. Aftermath can be misleading. What looked like a partly eaten meal could have been normal cabin disorder. What looked like eerie stillness may have followed hours of drift. What mattered on Kaz II was not the romance of the interior. It was the mechanics of deck loss. The stronger the storytelling becomes, the less it depends on decorative eeriness. That said, the interior details did something powerful for the public, and still do. They made the missing feel freshly present. A boat with all signs of life removed becomes a wreck. A boat with signs of life still visible becomes a wound. Kaz II was a wound. It let people picture presence and absence at once. Someone had been here. They should still be here. The sentence refuses to close. This double image also shaped media behavior. News outlets know that unresolved absence attracts attention most effectively when it can be visualized. Not all disappearances can be visualized well. Kaz II, the vessel offered a complete visual hook, wide shot of the catamaran, closer shot of the empty deck, mention of the engine, mention of the sail, mention of ordinary objects remaining. It was a ready-made mystery frame. That public framing helped make the case famous, but it also introduced distortion from the beginning, because public fame encourages every repeated detail to harden into certainty, whether or not it deserves to. For example, the public version often feels as if the vessel was discovered only minutes after the men vanished, as though the scene were preserved in perfect freshness. In reality, the boat had drifted unattended before discovery. That matters. It does not make the case less strange, but it changes how much weight should be placed on the exact arrangement of small objects below deck. By contrast, the larger features such as the operating engine, damaged sail, and absence of the crew remain highly relevant because they are structurally tied to what likely happened, not just atmospherically tied to how the story felt. The damaged sail in particular deserves attention because it is one of the clearest bridges between evidence and theory. Sail damage tells you the deck emergency was not imaginary. Something was wrong with the rig or sail handling. That does not tell you who went overboard first. It does tell you the disappearance did not occur on a perfectly quiescent vessel where all systems were in calm order. There was active instability. Once you accept that, the rest of the accidental sequence becomes easier to imagine without forcing it. One of the hardest truths in cases like this is that rescue attempts can create more casualties than original accidents. On land, we are used to the idea that helping another person is straightforwardly the moral action. At sea, helping must be mediated by control. A person who jumps in after someone else may be brave and still make the overall situation worse. A person who stays aboard to maneuver may look passive and still be acting correctly. But those distinctions are often impossible to hold in a real crisis involving loved ones. The public sees only outcomes and judges in comfort. The sea judges by seconds. If Peter went after James, or James after Peter, or Derek after either of them, the action may have been morally unthinkable to avoid even if it was strategically disastrous. That is one of the reasons the likely sequence feels tragic rather than stupid. It does not suggest three men making absurd decisions. It suggests ordinary human rescue instincts, operating in a medium where those instincts can outpace survival logic. There is also a lonely technical possibility within the broader accidental theory that deserves mention. If one man was still aboard after the others were in the water, he may have lost the chance to send a radio distress because the emergency never presented itself as stable enough for communication. People on land often imagine that a radio call is the obvious first action. In a fast-moving overboard emergency, keeping eyes on the people in the water may feel more urgent than taking those eyes away to transmit. The tragedy is that by the time command is lost completely, the radio remains on the boat, and the last person able to use it may already be gone. To the public, the untouched radio looks eerie. To maritime logic, it may look exactly like the residue of a rescue attempt that never stabilized. This difference between appearance and process sits at the center of the case. Almost every detail of Kaz II is more understandable when read as residue of process rather than a symbol of mystery. The engine running is not a supernatural flourish. It is residue of interrupted operation. The empty deck is residue of failed recovery. The safety gear still aboard is residue of involuntary absence. The damaged sail is residue of the original break. Once you adopt that lens, the case becomes less theatrically strange and more emotionally devastating. And still, the public cannot quite let go of the ghost yacht image. Why? Because rational explanation is not the same as sensory closure. The photographs still do what photographs do. They isolate a finished image from the movement that created it. That isolation creates an emotional vacuum. You can know, intellectually, that the most likely cause was a man overboard chain reaction and still feel a shiver looking at an empty catamaran under sunlight. The human brain is not built to regard inhabited spaces stripped of inhabitants without imagination rushing in. That rush of imagination is one reason so many later retellings overstate the case. Some suggest the men vanished in a narrow and impossible time window. Others imply the vessel was found in flawless order. Others try to convert the inquest reasoned conclusion into mere guesswork so that the mystery can stay commercially alive. But documentary storytelling should not confuse emotional impact with factual inflation. A case can be haunting and still have a strong probable explanation. Kaz II proves that. There is another way to understand the case that may be even more unsettling. The empty boat was not the mystery. The true mystery may have lasted less than 2 minutes. Everything after that was absence. If the decisive sequence took place in a very short interval, then the public's obsession with a later image risks missing the actual event entirely. The Rio Kaz II mystery may be one of the briefest in your channel's catalog, a tiny pocket of time in which an accident became a triple disappearance before the world even knew anything was wrong. That compression makes the story feel sharper. It also explains why so little can be known with confidence. Long crises leave more evidence. Short ones often leave only aftermath. The sea amplifies that problem by refusing to preserve fragile traces. No footprints, no stable debris field close to origin. No final spoken account. A small event can become nearly opaque once water gets hold of it. This is why the coronial language matters. Courts and inquests are often unsatisfying to audiences because they prefer probability to drama. But probability is what honors reality here. The coroner did not need to explain every second. He needed to identify the most likely pattern, supported by the physical state of the boat and the circumstances known. In one sense, that makes Kaz II less of a classic whodunit and more of a study in unresolved sequence. The answer is probably not who or what, it is how fast and in what order. For the families, however, order is not a small detail. Order is grief. If Peter went first, the case means one thing emotionally. If James went first, it means another. If Derek was the original casualty and father and son followed in rescue, that creates a different final story of loyalty and panic. Officially, these differences may not alter the broad conclusion. Privately, they are everything. This is one of the harshest divides between legal truth and human truth. The law can function with the broad pattern. Love wants the final seconds. The media cycle around Kaz II could not satisfy that need, so it did what media often does. It substituted atmosphere. The label Ghost Yacht was efficient because it transformed sequence into mood. But mood is poor comfort for the people left behind on shore. A famous case can sometimes feel lonelier for families precisely because the public owns an image, while they are left with the unanswered specifics the image cannot hold. There is something almost cruelly symmetrical about the boat being named Kaz II. The title is compact, clean, almost impersonal. It entered headlines easily. It became memorable in 2 short syllables. Yet behind that simple name were 3 separate lives with different histories, relationships, and expected futures. Public memory tends to compress. Peter and James and Derek become the crew of Kaz II. Their individuality thins as the boat's identity thickens. A responsible script should reverse that pressure wherever it can. The catamaran matters because it was the platform of their loss. It should never matter more than the men. When you bring them back to the center, the likely explanation becomes heavier, not lighter. We are not talking about anonymous sailors in an abstract demonstration of maritime risk. We are talking about a father and son and their friend whose final emergency probably unfolded within sight of one another on a bright coast, where nothing from shore would have looked apocalyptic. That contrast between outward normality and inward catastrophe is one of the things SilentEcho does best. The world does not go dark. Human life does. There is also a final practical angle worth considering. Even if one of the men remained on board for more time than the leading theory assumes, recovering 2 men from the water alone, from a catamaran under partial motion, would have been extraordinarily difficult. This matters because some viewers instinctively imagine the third man's survival as almost guaranteed if only he had stayed on the vessel. Not necessarily. A lone person on a moving boat trying to recover 2 adults in open sea while managing helm, power, visibility, and damaged rigging is already inside an extreme emergency. He might never have had a truly stable chance. The line between failed recovery and self-loss may have been very thin. That possibility strips blame of some of its easy certainty. It is tempting to ask why someone did not simply do the correct thing. But what if the correct thing was visible only in hindsight? What if every available option was already compromised? What if the deck problem, the people in the water, the vessel's momentum, and the emotional stakes created a field where no choice remained clean? Real disasters often look simple only after their complexity has been erased. By now, the pattern should be clear. The strongest version of this story is not the loudest one. It is the one that allows small realities to remain fatal. A damaged sail, a man overboard, a second man helping, a third losing command, a catamaran continuing on. 3 men lost to water before the world had any reason to listen. That is why the enduring question of Kaz II is secondary, is so sharp. It is not where they went in the broad sense. We know that. They went into the sea. The deeper question is what exactly loyalty looked like in the seconds before the boat became an empty headline. Which instinct fired first? Who saw what? Who chose? Who slipped? Who believed recovery was still possible for 1 second longer than it really was? And the reason that question endures is because it can never be fully answered without the men themselves. By the time authorities had the boat, they had already lost the only witnesses whose words could have transformed probability into narrative. Everything after that was reconstruction. Skilled, careful reconstruction, but reconstruction all the same. That does not make it weak. It makes it honest. An honest mystery documentary does not promise more than the evidence can carry. It lets the blank spaces stay blank, while showing why those spaces remain so emotionally charged. There is another thematic reason this case belongs in a channel devoted to wilderness and remote place mysteries. At first glance, Kaz II does not seem to fit the same category as a forest disappearance or a mountain vanishing. But it does, because the ocean is the purest form of a place that can erase sequence. Forests hide. Mountains isolate. Water separates and smooths. In all these environments, the missing do not simply vanish from view. They vanish into systems that do not preserve the order humans need for closure. The sea may be the most ruthless of all because it can return the object and keep the person. A backpack in the woods still says, "Search here." An empty catamaran says, "Search everywhere," and maybe nowhere. That is the emotional geometry families are left with. Everywhere and maybe nowhere. If the men were close to the vessel when they went over, maybe recovery was almost possible. If they drifted apart quickly, maybe it was over sooner than anyone wants to believe. If one remained aboard longer, maybe he watched the others disappear astern. If all 3 ended in the water almost immediately, then the boat's later drift is simply the blind continuation of a system that had already lost its human center. Every version hurts. None can be verified enough to close the case completely. And so Kaz survives in that narrow band where reason is strong and final knowledge is absent. The perfect breeding ground for haunting. A weaker script would try to turn that haunting into spectacle. It would force dark music into the gaps and imply that because we do not know every second, something impossible must have happened. But the world is already frightening enough without that. A boat can remain afloat and coherent while the crew is stripped away. Family and friendship can become the pathways by which multiple people are lost in the same emergency. The sea can make the aftermath look cleaner than the event itself. Those truths are more than enough. Perhaps the most disturbing image of all is not the discovered boat, but the unnoticed interval before discovery. Kaz II. Continued through water as a kind of moving after-image of human presence. For some span of time, the vessel existed in the world as an emergency no one had yet recognized. That is always one of the most chilling structures in disappearance cases. The danger has already happened. The world is still behaving normally because it does not yet know. Search has not begun. Headlines do not exist. Families are not yet afraid. And somewhere in that unrecognized interval, the missing are either fighting to survive or already gone. That interval is where reality is most merciless, because it shows how long a catastrophe can remain invisible simply by occurring beyond ordinary sight. The public later enters the story at the empty boat. The men lived at the story's true center earlier, in a short, unwitnessed crisis under open sky. This is why the conclusion to Kaz II lands so hard. The most likely explanation is simple enough to believe and tragic enough that part of the mind resists it. We want something stranger, because strange at least acknowledges the power of the image. Ordinary accident feels too small for such an unforgettable photograph. But the photograph is not the event. The photograph is what remains after the event has been erased. Once you understand that, the case becomes much more frightening. The event could have been small. It only had to be final, and final it was. No verified distress call, no recovered bodies, no witness from another vessel, no last account from shore. Just a catamaran taken into custody by the living after it had already lost the 3 men who gave it direction. That is, the enduring weight of Kaz II. Not a haunted yacht. A human sequence broken so completely that the boat outlived the testimony. And that may be worse. There is one more dimension to this case that deserves careful attention because it speaks to why certain mysteries become cultural fixtures while others fade. Kaz II combines 2 forms of disappearance that usually remain separate. It is both a missing persons case and an object survival case. In many vanishings, the environment takes everything. No body, no vehicle, no vessel, no stable scene. In Kaz II, the opposite happened. The scene survived better than the people. That inversion creates a special kind of obsession, because it lets later audiences inspect the shell of the event without ever touching the event itself. The more inspectable the shell, the more people imagine that certainty should be possible. When certainty still fails to appear, the case feels cursed rather than limited. But limitations are the real story here. Limits of witness, limits of maritime recovery, limits of what machinery can tell us once the humans are gone. That matters because the strongest mystery storytelling does not simply point at a blank and say, "Look how strange." It explains why the blank exists. In Kaz II, the blank exists because the vessel remained above the sea while the men likely did not. The sea separated evidence by type. Durable structure survived. Vulnerable bodies disappeared. It is a brutally logical division. And logic of that kind can look eerie when viewed from land. The public reaction also reveals something about modern fear. Empty vessels strike at a deep nerve because they symbolize failed continuity. A boat is a promise. It promises passage, platform, shelter, command. When it is found adrift without crew, every one of those promises appears broken at once. Yet Kaz II also demonstrates that the promises were not false in some magical sense. They were contingent. They held only while human command remained intact. Once command failed, the boat reverted to being what it always was underneath the promise. Material in motion. This is why the case never needed supernatural language. The most chilling phrase in the whole story may not be ghost yacht at all. It may be adrift with one engine running. That is enough. Enough to tell you the vessel still possessed energy. Enough to tell you the emergency did not destroy its operating core, enough to imply that for some crucial interval, the machinery of movement continued after the machinery of human survival had broken down. If you picture that too clearly, the case becomes almost unbearable. Somewhere in those final unwitnessed minutes, there may have been a point when the catamaran was still close enough to matter, close enough to represent rescue, close enough for the men in the water to believe it could still return to them. And then, through some combination of speed, maneuver, visibility, and failing control, it ceased to be theirs in any practical sense. It became a moving object, and they became people watching it move away. That is a devastating transformation, not simply because it implies abandonment, but because the abandonment was probably unchosen. No one decided to leave. The leaving happened through loss of command. This distinction is morally crucial. The men were not separated from the boat by indifference. They were likely separated by an emergency that overwhelmed the available human responses. This is also why the case lingers differently from deliberate crime or obvious disaster. Crimes usually contain motive. Obvious disasters contain force. Kaz II contains neither in a satisfying public form. What it contains is sequence without witness. That is an especially cruel kind of mystery, because it withholds the one thing people use to make peace with terrible outcomes. Narrative. Once narrative is lost, the mind loops. It goes back to the same likely scene and asks for details the evidence cannot provide. Did the third man shout instructions to the others? Did one of the men in the water tell him not to come after them? Did the damaged sail distract at exactly the wrong second? Did someone believe the dinghy or a line could be used in recovery? Did they remain together in the sea or separate almost immediately? These are not sensational questions. They are human questions, and because they are human, they do not weaken the case by remaining unanswered. They deepen it. There is another temptation worth resisting, the temptation to make the men symbols of hubris, masculinity, or maritime overconfidence. Stories about adult men at sea often attract that framing because it gives the audience a moral lesson. They thought they could handle it. The sea humbled them. Sometimes that lesson fits. Here it feels too easy. Nothing in the known facts requires arrogance to explain the outcome. The likely sequence could have overwhelmed cautious people just as easily because it targeted the narrowest margin in small crew seamanship. One person in water, one rescue impulse, one vessel still moving. That is not hubris. That is vulnerability. If anything, the case is more unsettling because it appears to have punished ordinary decency rather than extraordinary error. A man may have tried to save another. Another may have tried to save both. The sea does not reward moral instinct just because it is morally admirable. That indifference is one of the harshest truths open water teaches. In that sense, Kaz II belongs alongside the most enduring real wilderness mysteries, not because it has the same setting, but because it reveals the same structure. The environment does not need to become mythical. It only needs to remain itself while human confidence meets a bad minute. Forests do this by confusing direction. Mountains do this by multiplying consequences of small slips. The sea does it by turning separation into disappearance before the mind has accepted what is happening. By the time the public learns the story, it is already too late for anything but interpretation. That too is part of the haunting. The viewer stands where the search stood, looking backward with incomplete tools, trying to reconstruct an event that took place inside a system designed to erase fragile traces. In some cases, interpretation grows stronger as more evidence appears. In Kaz II, interpretation remains bounded because the critical evidence was almost certainly the bodies and their voices, and those were the very things the sea withheld. There is a hard dignity in accepting that boundary. It keeps the case real. Peter Tunstead, James Tunstead, Derek Batten, not phantoms, not props in a ghost ship fable. 3 men most likely lost to a swift chain of events on a real voyage off Queensland. Their absence became famous because the boat survived them. Their humanity remains important because the likely explanation points not to mystery, for mystery's sake, but to a disaster shaped by responsibility, loyalty, and the terrifying speed of open water. If the empty catamaran still bothers people now, years later, it may be because it exposes a truth many would rather not face. Human order is thinner than it looks. We build structures around danger and call them safety. Sometimes they are safety. Sometimes they are only safety until the wrong event selects the one weakness we cannot manage in time. Kaz II was still a boat. The sea was still the sea. The men were still within a world of ordinary causes, and still the result feels unreal. That unreality is the echo this case leaves behind. Not because the case defeats reason, but because reason stops just short of restoring the final human sequence. It can say enough to be convincing and not enough to be complete. For some mysteries, that would be a flaw. For Kaz II, it is the source of its power, so the enduring question is not simply where they went. It is whether the empty boat we remember was created by panic, by loyalty, by a father's instinct, by a friend's reflex, by a damaged sail, or by some mix of all of them, compressed into one brutal interval. The official answer reaches toward that interval and names its most likely shape. The emotional answer remains out at sea with the men themselves, and that is why this case endures. Because a boat came back to the world without the people who belonged on it, because probability explained more than myth ever could and still could not end the ache, because the sea left behind the machine and kept the voices, and because somewhere between a damaged sail and an empty deck, 3 ordinary lives were reduced to one of the most haunting maritime disappearances Australia has ever seen.